and I am Policy Counsel at the Law Society of Upper Canada. To my far left, I have Shaheen Azmi, who is the Director of the Policy, Equity, Monitoring and Outreach Branch at the Ontario Human Rights Commission. Then I have to his right Mark Allen, who is the Executive Director of Human Rights and Indigenous Affairs Policy at Global Affairs Canada. And then I have Judge David Arnott, who is the Chief Commissioner for the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission, and Cassie Palmer, who is the Director of Education and Engagement at the Alberta Human Rights Commission. In the interest of time, I'll direct you to the files in the program so that we can continue the conversation. And just a little bit of information about the format of the panel. We'll have about a 45-minute discussion about this topic, during which I'll have the panel answer a few questions. And then we'll open up the floor to questions from all of you for the last 15 minutes. So I'd ask that you hold your questions until then. But I'd like to ensure that we have 15 minutes at least for a nice discussion about this topic. So I think I'll just launch right into the questions so that we can move forward. So the first question I'd like to ask is for Shaheen, Judge Arnott, and Cassie. And the question is, what role do human rights commissions play in advancing human rights in Canada?
Well, of course, human rights commissions in Canada are charged with the responsibility in their mandates to promote and protect human rights. And in answering that question, I'd like to tell you that in Saskatchewan, we built in 2010 a new four-pillar approach, and I see the future based on that. So we've always said that we're very good at investigating. We're very good at investigating and litigating, and in effect, gatekeeping us to the cases that actually go to tribunals for discussion. And the big thing in Saskatchewan is we don't have a tribunal anymore. We go right to the Court of Queen's Bench as opposed to the tribunal, and that's because the tribunal model in Saskatchewan was thoroughly discredited. It was discredited on a number of fronts, mainly because it took way too long to have litigation go through the traditional tribunal model. The result is that we've changed our whole focus, our whole ethos with respect to human rights promotion and protection, and we focus primarily on problem solving and getting resolution in cases in a very, very short order, and we do that by pre-complaint resolution. So I believe the focus, the myopic focus on litigation in many jurisdictions is outdated. It doesn't fit with the future. Our focus in Saskatchewan is based on using restorative justice approaches, getting the parties together out of a very quick and efficient, effective way to do the resolution of complaints. And the world's record for a resolution stood in 2014. From the time a complaint came in to the time it was resolved was 34 minutes. That was broken in 2015, 22 minutes. This summer, broken 4 minutes and 30 seconds with the Regina Copel Health Region, a big institution. So we found that resolving these questions in a very short order, getting the parties together, effectively using restorative principles has produced some very, very significant results. I'll be speaking later. I'm going to speak about two other features of our new approach, and that is systemic advocacy and the model we use there, and then a primary focus, and I think the answer to many questions, and certainly for the future, is an investment in education in the K-12 system, and I'll speak to that later. I think in terms of what, I'm limited to those short answers there. So myopic litigation, outdated, doesn't work, obtuse, doesn't get the right results. Mediation, restorative justice, problem solving, appropriate case resolution is what we apply. That's the policy we have. We're building on it, and I believe that will be a model for the rest of Canada in many ways, because the litigation model is not effective, far too expensive, takes too long, and produces poor results generally, not the best results.
Well, when I'm thinking about human rights commissions and their work, I'm thinking about really a larger human rights system, some of which David was talking about. I'm thinking about the system that includes courts, human rights tribunals, arbitrators, the work that's done within organizations. Can you hear me now? And I'm also thinking about civil society organizations and everyone here in this room who we all play a part in that larger human rights system. The part that the Commission is responsible for is the part that essentially where a government is committed to a certain standard for addressing human rights conflicts, where the government commits to build awareness and understanding and also in advancing to protect human equality rights. So that's essentially the work of the Commission, and our key goal for our Commission is full participation without discrimination in the social, economic, political and cultural life of the province. So that's kind of where we see the need to achieve results. Most people, when they think about commissions, do think of the complaint resolution processes, which David's outlined some of the limitations of those processes. I think there's a couple of others. One is that people have choices whether to bring a complaint to a commission or not to bring a complaint. And so that means that a commission is only seeing a select number of issues that are happening out there in society. Another thing is that the Commission acts as a gatekeeper through the processes that it has in place to review a complaint, to decide whether to accept it, and then how to process it. We know there are timeliness issues around complaint processes that most commissions are engaged with. And we know there are also perceptions out there about how commissions maybe, among complainants, believe they may be favoring respondents. Respondents sometimes believe they're favoring complainants. So there are real limitations to the complaint resolution process, but also some very important successes through that system. The part of the process that I'm involved in is the upstream preventative work that commissions do, and I think, as David was alluding to, some of the really important work that needs to go on in working together with in collaboration, sometimes in true partnership, sometimes in collaboration, sometimes in a complementary way, with a variety of different organizations and players and government bodies to work towards social change and moving the needle on social change in the direction that we want it to move in. So that's some of the important work that I think commissions are now doing in terms of advancing human rights, is that upstream, preventative, proactive work that is not necessarily related to the complaint processes that some commissions continue to engage in. But the landscape of human rights commissions is really varied and is changing dramatically across the country. And there is, I don't think, there's a series of different models. My commission has a different model than David's commission. I work in an organization that a human rights tribunal is part of that corporate body. There's the commission that receives complaints, and complaints that don't settle might end up at a human rights tribunal, which is a different part of the organization, but still part of that body. And then the third part of our work is that proactive, preventative upstream work that I was mentioning. So that's how we're engaged in kind of advancing human rights.
So I'll basically speak to Ontario. We have a relatively unique model in Ontario. We don't have a commission that receives complaints. All other commissions across the country receives complaints directly. We are a direct access model. I'll try to speak up. I'm realizing people have trouble hearing me, so I'll try to speak. Ours is a direct access model. So people file complaints with the Human Rights Tribunal in Ontario directly, and the tribunal offers a process which includes mediation, ultimately litigation, adjudication if that's necessary. There is a Human Rights Legal Support Center that supports complainants to apply to deal with complaints or file complaints with the tribunal. However, they're not able to support all claims being made to the tribunal, so they're quite overloaded, and in the in minority of such cases. The Commission, the Ontario Rights Commission, used to receive complaints about 8 years ago. That changed. About 8 years ago, the Commission became a specifically systemic-oriented human rights body. So we address systemic human rights issues using various tools, things like policy development, public education, outreach, monitoring of human rights inquiry, research work, and public interest litigation. So in Canada, we're fairly unique in having that very specific systemic focus, and that does allow us considerable leeway in dealing with human rights issues. We're not locked to dealing with complaints and then the complaints directing us. We're sort of able to respond to issues that come to us from all kinds of directions, things that basically we determine to be very important, significant issues that we can address at a systemic level. And a lot of our activity then flows from that, and I'll get an opportunity to talk about more of that in a while, but basically that gives us a unique kind of position, and we deal with issues in a really unique way in Ontario that we've been able to carry quite far. So I'll leave it there, just in time, and we'll discuss this.
Now, Mark, your role is slightly different. So in May of 2016, the Honourable Stéphane Dion announced the creation of the Office of Human Rights, Freedoms and Inclusion. So I'd like to ask you, what role does this office play in advancing human rights in Canada and internationally? And can you tell us a little bit about some of the policy initiatives that the office is involved in?
Well, thank you very much. And let me first of all say, on behalf of Global Affairs Canada and Minister Dion, what a delight it is for me to be here today on this panel. You did allude to the differences between our office and the Human Rights Commission machinery in Canada at the federal and provincial levels, and maybe I'll say a word about that before I talk about the office. So I'm a member of the executive branch of the Canadian government, so we develop and formulate policies. There is, of course, a Canadian Human Rights Commission at the federal level to oversee the federal government and the federally regulated sectors, who, like my provincial colleagues here, have an adjudicative, a mediative, sometimes a litigative function, which we don't have in a government department. Where we have similarities, I think it's around the protection and the promotion of respect for human rights, and we have different tools to do that. So in global affairs, we're the Canadian Foreign Ministry, and my own career has been sort of spent inside and outside of Canada at Canadian embassies overseas. And so we have the tools of that international system to use at our disposal to protect human rights, both in Canada and around the world. So you asked about the Office of Human Rights, Freedoms and Inclusion, of which I'm a member, which has only existed since May. But it didn't arise out of nothing. So what Minister Dion found when he took up the mandate after the election was a standalone Office of Religious Freedom and an Ambassador of Religious Freedom. And after some advice and decision-making, that office was folded into other parts of the organization responsible for democracy and human rights. And the ambassador function was essentially spread across our system. So every Canadian ambassador, head of high commissioner, consul general now has in their own mandate commitments a responsibility to protect and promote human rights in their countries of accreditation. So to give you an example, they're rated annually on those commitments, and they have to be able to manage a budget and an office, and of course. But those other commitments vary, and so in the past, for example, they've had to promote Canadian trade and economics, and so now this government has chosen to put human rights as part of their mandate. So what the office does is it sort of brings Canada's responsibilities into the international system. So the system of courts and commissions that you've heard about here in Canada exists internationally. Canada takes on treaty commitments And you'll know some of those: the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, various treaties that have developed over time. We've signed up to those, like others. So we're responsible to meet those commitments, and we're also responsible to ensure that others meet those commitments. So that's what my group does, is the interface with the international system, both in terms of that outward scrutiny of others and the scrutiny of Canada itself. And so there's a number of bodies associated with each of those conventions, called treaty bodies, who look at Canada's record in terms of meeting those commitments. They meet regularly, they're set cycles. And so we both ensure that Canadian voices serve on those bodies, the Canadian experts and jurists serve on those bodies, so that we can have a high standard of scrutiny for others around the world. But also that when those bodies scrutinize Canada's track record, that we then look at those recommendations and see how they can be meaningfully implemented. So that's a great deal of the work that we do. There's also work around sort of thematic policy initiatives. So the focus on diversity and inclusion that we've heard a lot about today, we're looking at how we can broaden that into the international sphere as well. And so Minister Dion at the General Assembly a few weeks ago hosted a high-level panel on diversity and inclusion. Other sort of thematic areas of interest that Canada's been developing are around the abolition of the death penalty around the world, controversial issues in many countries, decriminalization of same-sex conduct around the world, and the promotion and protection of human rights defenders, so those who stand up and put themselves in danger to fight for human rights. So that's cool.
So I'd like to turn it back to the role of human rights commissions just for a moment. So this question is for Cassie, Shaheen, and Janet. The question is that human rights commissions are mandated to develop public policy on human rights and engage in public education activities to prevent discrimination. So can you tell us a little bit about some of the public education and or policy development work your commission is working on, and what have been some of the challenges in doing that work?
All right, well, thank you for that. I guess my main message today is that we need a significant investment in education in Canada on human rights issues, and I've got a proposal for that. The Aga Khan came to Canada in 2010, and he said Canada stands as a testament against the history, stands as a testament. The most successful country in the world as a multicultural model. And he's absolutely right, but there's a fragility attached to that. And the fragility is directly related to the knowledge, understanding, and commitment all Canadians have to our multicultural, multi-theist, multi-ethnic Canada. And as we saw in the Angus Reid poll recently, that the support for multiculturalism in Canada isn't as strong as it should be. So the solution to that is to make an investment in education in the grades K to 12 education system. And we've done that in Saskatchewan. So in Saskatchewan, we created a pedagogy from grades K to 12 that answers the question, what does it mean to be a Canadian citizen? What are the rights of citizenship? What are the responsibilities that go with those rights? And how do you build and maintain respect for every citizen? Why? Because every human being deserves equal moral consideration. We call that the new 3 Rs. It's available in French and English, and it's available in every school in Saskatchewan. We want to see that mandated in Saskatchewan. That's part of our goal. What we're saying, the end result will be a student who embodies 5 E's. A student will be an enlightened student, an ethical student, an empathetic student, an engaged student, and an empowered student. So that's the end result. Woven throughout that pedagogy is the notion of belonging and inclusion. And that is very critical to inculcate in students right at the very young ages, starting at age 5 in grade K. So that's what this pedagogy is designed to do. What are we trying to do with this pedagogy? We're trying to change the culture in the community by changing the culture in the school first. So we make this investment at the front end. In terms of human rights, we're going to see a lot less, I believe, complaints or litigation about human rights, much better understanding about what human rights are to do in Canada, why they're so important to promote and protect, but to do it by teaching the students what it means to be a Canadian, how important our multicultural country is. It's an important model for the world. We need to make this investment. If we fail to make this investment, I think we're going to see the same kinds of cases coming through the Human Rights Commissions in the future as we have in the past. And I was quite shocked when I became Human Rights Commissioner in 2009 when I saw the kinds of complaints that were coming through the system in Saskatchewan. Racism, discrimination against females, gender discrimination. Things that I had thought, in my mind anyway, naively, had been cured 20 years before. Certainly not the case, and sadly these complaints continue to exist. We must be proactive. We can't expect that human rights or citizenship rights will be embraced but somehow by osmosis without some kind of proactive, rigorous education. We need to do it in the school system. We have that model. I commend that model to you. I would say this, by the way, that in speaking to educators, and I'm thinking primarily of Pasi Sahlberg, the well-known Finlandist educator, best education system in the world. I asked Pasi Sahlberg a couple of years ago at Harvard, do you know of any jurisdiction in the Western world that's proposing to do citizenship education with the rigor that we're proposing to do in Saskatchewan? And he said, no, you're the only jurisdiction that's doing it in that way. He further went on to say publicly, and he's written about this, that the future of education will always include numeracy and literacy, but there's a new pathway coming, and the new pathway is citizenship education, the concept of building the whole citizen, building the complete citizen. In order to arm teachers with the ability to have the discussions in the classroom, we've also created what we call a document for teachers, courageous conversations. Courageous conversations must occur. There are 6 areas of courageous conversations that are attached to this pedagogy. The first one is the Holocaust, the world's response to the Holocaust, the UN Declaration on Human Rights, and the rights revolution that we saw post the Second World War in the last half of the last century. This pedagogy challenges students, particularly at the high school level, to be part of a new revolution. The new revolution is to be part of the responsibility revolution. That's what we want to see in the first half of the 21st century, and I think that if we do this pedagogy, make this investment, we'll see that. So fundamentally, we're trying to inculcate in students what it means to be a Canadian, the strengths of this country. We all know that Canada is, in fact, the best experiment in pluralism the world has ever seen, but we also know as human rights, people involved in human rights issues in Canada, we have a long way to go. We have a long way to go. We've gone a long ways, but we have a long way to go. Embedded in this pedagogy, by the way, is something that was developed in Saskatchewan in the year 2000, became mandatory in Saskatchewan in 2008. We're all treaty people teaching treaties in the classroom. In addition, it incorporates the residential school experience. It's embedded right in. And that's important because I believe this pedagogy that's been developed, and by the way, we want to share this with every jurisdiction in Canada, that this pedagogy is a significant answer to the Truth and Reconciliation's call to action on education, particularly in the K-12 system. So that's what the big message I wanted to impart to you today, to let you know that, and to hope in your jurisdictions you promote the concept that we must teach students what it means to be a Canadian citizen, what are the rights of citizenship, and I'll just talk a little bit about that, if I might, just to amplify this a little further. We say that students need to know and understand the rights of Canadian citizenship so they don't knowingly transgress the rights of others. That's a fundamental that goes with the education. In terms of responsibility, what we're saying to students is this. You have a responsibility to make the world a better place. You have a responsibility to look through a lens that says, how can we make this place get better? How can we make the community better, your school, the larger community, the province, the country, and have international respect? So that's the lens we want students to see the world. making the world a better place, making that commitment. You may never get there because that requires perfection, but we want to inculcate in students a passion to be respectful of others and to always think of what we can do in a social justice context to make the world a better place. So that's fundamentally what the responsibilities are. The third responsibility for every student is to respect every fellow citizen without exception. So it's an inclusive belonging pedagogy. So that, in my short dissertation, is what I'm
I'll stand up because I have a hard time projecting. Yes, the Commission in Ontario has actually got quite a few things going. And we only have 5 minutes, so I'm only going to just focus on some of our more recent bigger activities around policy. We have recently just released a policy on creed human rights. It's an update of a policy from 1996. It's quite a substantial increase in content compared to the old policy. It provides guidance on what is creed, what is human rights in Ontario that affects creed, what are types of examples of discrimination, accommodation issues. The biggest chunk of creed human rights complaints relate to accommodation. And so there's a whole description of the accommodation process. And there's a special section in there on Indigenous spirituality, which basically opens the territory because creed is not exactly what is religion. The Human Rights Code of Ontario speaks to creed, and creed covers more territory, which includes, from our interpretation, Aboriginal spirituality, as well as other types of expression of faith and faith-like activity. So we've given a lot of interpretation to areas that have been foggy for quite a few years. So it's a very important topical policy right now because the society, we all know, is evolving, and creed issues are literally all over the place in public discussion, public policy, and we're providing we think a thorough guidance on how Human Rights Code in Ontario would interpret creed and policy, creed in general. We also do a lot of training on that, so we've been doing follow-up training sessions across the province. There's one coming up in London in November, one in North Bay at the end of November. We'll be continuing to do these over the years, and we invite those who are interested in participating in those to come, of course, and if you're interested in engaging in some kind of development around create human rights, you can contact us and we'll see if we can work together. The other big area which I'll focus on is actually one that, if you asked me 10 years ago, we would have said the same issue, and it's racial profiling. We at the Ontario Rights Commission have been working on racial profiling in Ontario for now over 12 years. Initially, the issue came up to us from obviously public disquiet about policing and policing behavior with respect to particularly some racialized communities, African Canadian communities, Indigenous communities in the north. And we started an inquiry into this now going way back to 2003. And we've continued to work at it in multiple ways. We have litigated on it, we've done an inquiry report, we've developed a policy on racism and racial discrimination. We have worked with police organizations directly to educate on racial profiling. We have, in the recent few years, settled some human rights complaints by requiring police services to collect data on traffic stops. The Auto Police Service was that organization that agreed to do that. They just released their data collection report 2 days ago, and we have been working on it with them and other organizations all this time. I can say overall that it remains a major concern of the Ontario Rights Commission. While we have done all this activity, we still find significant resistance in policing organizations and beyond policing to other organizations that can engage in similar kind of behavior. Security agencies, customs, and those kinds of elements of education and child welfare that can also engage in profiling. All of these locations, we believe, still engage actively in some type of racial profiling. At a systemic level, at the very least, sometimes directly. And they have not, from our understanding, taken the issue seriously enough to really look at what's going on internally within their institutions to address it. So we remain concerned about that. We are, because of that, right now focusing on developing policy guidance on racial profiling for different sectors, for the policing sector, for the child welfare sector, for the education sector. That's research consultation work that we've been doing for the last few years. We expect to be able to provide this policy guidance in about a year's time from now, at least for the policing sector, and then moving on to the other sectors after that. So there's been an area of significant focus and concern for us. We think it reflects a really significant issue. We have lots and lots of complaints filed on racial profiling matters in Ontario, and we have many communities highly concerned about their treatment by people who are ostensibly there to protect them. So this is the area I think I would focus your attention on. There's a lot of other things that we do in the Commission. We have a significant staff, almost 50 staff that is focused on six human rights at this broad systemic level. I'll just point out one other one. The big area is corrections. And the entire status of human rights within the corrections institutions in this province. Just recently we released a submission on segregation, basically requesting the province of Ontario commit to essentially eliminating segregation as the de facto process for dealing with mental health problems. That is a big issue, and we work on this activity. So there are a lot of other things, but I'll just stop there because
I was so interested to hear David talk about the upstream work that you're doing on curriculum, and Shaheen talk about the work, the very important systemic work with different sectors, and the tracking and the monitoring and the analysis and the research and analysis that they do, and then the policy response. I want to talk to you about a different kind of work, which is also work that I think the other commissions do in different ways, and that's the collaborative work with community around community issues. We don't have the policy focus that Ontario has, and we don't have the focus that Saskatchewan has on that K-12 work, which I think is, and we all think is so important. Our work has been around the intersection of human rights issues with issues that the community brings to us and that we go out to the community and engage on. And some of the issues in particular that are a strong focus for us at this point in time are issues of poverty, issues of homelessness, issues of underemployment and unemployment. So these are issues where people experience marginalization, they're stigmatized, they experience discrimination. There's all kinds of issues. There's an inextricable link between human rights and those kinds of issues. So I'll just give you a couple of examples of the work that we're engaged in. One issue that we were involved with was with the Calgary Homeless Foundation in developing the first homeless charter of rights in Canada. And that was a project where, working collaboratively with the foundation and with other organizations, there was a realization that we needed to have a dialogue. We talked this morning, we heard this morning about how important dialogue was, and how important it was to talk about the issues that people with lived experience had. And so this was an initiative where people with lived experience were part of the steering committee. That means that people who were homeless, who did not have a home, were part of the project direction, as well as people from across a variety of sectors. One of the things that was really interesting about the project is that it really did start that dialogue, and everyone's perspective was included, and people who were part of it, who were themselves people who had lived experience, talked about how that participation was so important to them. It really, for them, it moved the conversation from us and them to we, and that was a really important shift. And that it was also, interestingly, really foundational work that could lead to other kinds of things. So, for example, the involvement in that initiative led to more engagement in the democratic process. So, talking about civic engagement. So there were mock votes. There was a mock vote in the one of the drop-in shelters, and then the first voting station set up for people who are homeless was set up in the drop-in center, so that people could actually experience their democratic right to vote, something that they wouldn't otherwise be able to do. So that, does a Charter of Right change homelessness? No. But it is a piece, a foundational piece, and one of many pieces. So I think there's a lesson. You asked us about, I think maybe lessons as well, lessons learned. And one of the lessons is that, for us, is that there are very few simple problems. They're complex issues, and they need complex strategies. And we can maybe contribute to part of that strategy building and strategy implementation, but we are one part of a much larger initiative. It's also challenging to be, that there's always a balance between trying to anticipate and then trying to be reactive and responsive. And how to find that balance is another piece for us, both within our work within an initiative, but also with the other work of the Commission. Because there are capacity and resource issues that undoubtedly you know about in your own organizations, and setting priorities is a piece that's also challenging, because when you're working with a series of other sectors, then you're really looking for some alignment around the priorities, but they may not always mesh. And so that's a situation. We have been very humbled by our experience working on different projects. And as we realize our own capacity and our own competency limitations, not just our capacity limitations, but our competency limitations. And so for us, it's also been any of the work that we do, really, we have to look at ourselves and say, what is it that we need to learn? What is it that we all have to open our hearts and our minds to that we don't know? How do we collectively sustain our energy around issues of long-term social change that sometimes seem to suck the energy out of us, and then other times are extremely exhilarating when projects move forward to successful outcomes. And I guess another lesson for us is that we always have to remind ourselves about is that social change takes time. And so the work that we're doing as commissions in partnership or collaboration with civil society organizations, different orders of government, with other commissions sometimes on issues, they're all about moving the needle on social change, and that is something that we all know is difficult, long-term work that no one can do on their own. And so that's the way we feel about the work of the commission as well.
Now, Mark, you had mentioned some of the policy initiatives that the Office of Human Rights, Freedoms, and Inclusion is involved in, such as abolition of the death penalty and protection of human rights offenders. I'm sure you've faced quite a few challenges in doing that work, and I was wondering if you could speak maybe a bit about those challenges and how to address them.
Yeah, well, the two challenges very quickly. The first is the situation of human rights around the world. And I mean, in Canada, I think we know that discrimination exists consciously, unconsciously, on many different grounds, often very inconvenient. If you leave Canada's borders, I think you can knock that up by a factor of many fold. And I think we know that because many Canadians come to this country to escape persecution in other lands, and so when we're working, internationally to look at that persecution, it's very serious. And I mentioned the death penalty, I mentioned the criminalization of same-sex conduct, but enforced disappearances, arbitrary executions, this is common currency in many places. And not only the situation in countries themselves, but the fact that the regimes in many different countries, in many different regions, will use the tools of the international system that I talked about earlier, this system of United Nations resolutions and committees and visits and scrutiny, to roll back the progress that women, that sexual minorities, that other minorities are making around the world. And that's very serious, and that's of great concern to us at the federal level. Another real challenge, I think, is back at home. how we balance our various interests. So we have a clear commitment to human rights. We also have other interests at the national level. So economic prosperity, right? And sometimes we have to strike balances between our dialogues with our trading partners and a commitment to human rights. I mean, fortunately, having an open door means that you can have the dialogue with your trading partners and raise these issues in a way that's constructive. Another example is national security. So there are people who would want to come to Canada to do us harm. And so ensuring that we don't cross any lines in terms of how we implement those policies from a human rights perspective is also critically important. And so we're constantly striking those balances and ensuring that we don't cross those lines. And I think the way we're structured as a government is in order to be able to do that, to protect all of our interests.